Hi people, it's Archivist here, and today I'm going to be reviewing this brand new iPad Pro 2020, and from the front you could easily be mistaken for thinking this is the 2018 model because from the front this thing is absolutely identical. It's not until you spin it around and take a look at the back that you'll notice that there's a new camera array system. So the most important one, I think, for most people is the addition of the wide-angle lens, which is pretty good. It takes decent photos, and it's most useful when you're trying to take a photo but you have very limited space. So you're trying to back up to get more detail, but you just can't. And so the wide-angled lens is quite useful in situations such as that. But the reality is, as we all know, tablet photography just isn't in the same league as smartphone photography, both in terms of quality. I mean, with these cameras, they aren't actually on the same level as even the iPhone 11, let alone the iPhone 11 Pro and Pro Max. But also, as many will tell you, the best camera is the camera you have with you, and the reality is that most of the time that's going to be your smartphone, it won't be your tablet. But having said that, I do believe that tablet photography does have a place because it may seem like a small thing, but it's very useful to just have an absolutely massive viewfinder that is the screen of the iPad Pro. So on the 11-inch, it's pretty darn big. You're going to be able to see a pretty accurate representation of what you're going to be editing with. And then that's even more so if you've opted to go for the 12.9-inch model. There is also the LiDAR sensor, which is there to enhance augmented reality. It can quickly scan a room and detect all of the surfaces, so when you place a 3D object into it, it can very rapidly put it into the room. And although you can definitely do this on any iPhone, the LiDAR sensor just makes it faster, so you don't have to wave your phone around awkwardly at each surface in order to detect it. So it's a little bit of a bonus, but it was definitely not something that made me jump for joy. I think it's going to have a very specific use for a very specific group of customers. So for me, the iPad Pro's greatest strength is in its performance and its just overall robustness. So this iPad Pro is actually not much more powerful than the 2018 model. In fact, in terms of the CPU, it's almost no difference, like to the point where it's completely negligible. The only modest upgrade is to do with the GPU, and I believe that this is a roughly 5 to 10% gain based on benchmarks I've seen, but even still, there aren't a lot of games that take advantage of the old GPU, so why would it be much of a bonus to have this here? That's the reality of owning an iPad Pro, and it has been really since their inception, is that they've always been so far ahead of the software for them. They've been the opposite, I sometimes find, of a MacBook Air, where a MacBook Air has access to more advanced desktop class software, but it doesn't quite have the power to always perform in them. And then you've got the iPad Pro, which has lots of power, but it doesn't quite have the application sophistication to take advantage of that power. And that's what a lot of people worry about when they're thinking, do I want to replace my computer with it? Because although it may be very capable at the tasks it can it do every task I need it to do? And sometimes you just find yourself like with little things that you don't even think of as being a constraint, and they do happen to be a little constraint, but they are become fewer and fewer. I mean, having the file system on the iPad that it has now with iPadOS, that for me makes it far more viable as a replacement for a MacBook, for example. But, you know, even small things like just not being able to have multiple windows thrown all over the place in a traditional desktop setting. And I'm not saying it should be, because that really wouldn't be right for the touch interface aspect of the iPad Pro, but it is something that it's just a detractor, you know. As good as the multitasking may be with the iPad Pro 2020, it's just not as intuitive, I think, as easy as it is with a MacBook. In terms of the latest iPadOS update, we now have far more full-featured support for mice and trackpads. And this, by the way, is not exclusive to this 2020 iPad. It's coming across the board. It just so happens to coincide with this release, so a lot of people are talking about it at the same time. and I've certainly found it to be quite transformative in terms of the way I use my iPad. I've got the keyboard attachment, it's just the basic keyboard from Apple. We haven't got the Magic Keyboard as of yet, and I'm pairing this with the Magic Mouse, and I am really surprised at how things do just seem to work. The scrolling, I wasn't sure if scrolling would work as well as it does, but it's honestly just as good as if I was doing it on a MacBook. Scrolling is solid. Clicking responsiveness, also fine. I also quite like the cursor, which sometimes transforms when you're using native apps or just the general UI of the iPad. One thing I can certainly say is that it's a massive step up from the previous mouse support we had before, where it was more of an accessibility option, and even Apple weren't really raving about it because they knew it wasn't full featured. It was just the bare minimum of mimicking a finger tap. But this actually feels like they're, really trying to integrate it. Having said that though, we're still going to need to wait, I think, for other app developers to fully start supporting the mouse or indeed trackpad as a primary method of using it, because although it works fine in apps at the moment, it doesn't always feel like the right thing to do, if that makes sense. You'll notice what I mean especially if you play some games on the App Store. A lot of them just don't really work well for the mouse pointer. So I also decided to try editing this very video on the iPad Pro. I had no doubt that the power would be there, but I thought just how would it feel? How convenient would it be? And I suppose as of me actually talking, I can't be entirely honest because I'm not done with editing it. But from using LumaFusion, which a friend of mine recommended as a pretty high caliber editing tool for an iPad, and using that with the mouse and the keyboard was pretty good. There were a few things that I had to go back to using touch-based, unless I just accepted it being overly cumbersome. But I was surprised at how productive I could be. Definitely not on the level of using Final Cut Pro on my MacBook Pro, to be honest. So it's not going to be a replacement. But what I think it could be useful for is if I'm traveling somewhere, which obviously, like the rest of the world, I'm not at the moment, but if I am traveling somewhere and I don't want to bring my MacBook Pro with me, well, I know that this can essentially get the job done. I just maybe need to take things a bit slower to accommodate for the smaller screen and interface. But the thing is, it's the iPad Pro, so a lot of people feel like they have to talk about it as a Pro device. But advantages such as the speakers and the screen in particular, the P3 color gamut screen, and the 120Hz refresh rate make it such a fantastic media consumption device. And I have to be real with you guys, I can imagine a lot of people do just buy it for media consumption. I know that I'm going to be using it for media consumption a lot more than productivity. And if you're thinking like, I don't need this because I'm not aiming to use it for productivity, I would not worry about that at all, because the speaker benefits and the screen quality, they make it a fantastic device for viewing videos, photos, social media, all kinds of things. It all adds up to just an overall positive experience. And although the most basic iPad can get the job done for most of what I can do on the iPad Pro, the iPad Pro just makes it a joy to do. It's like making technology magic. It all just comes together wonderfully. And it used to be that the price we paid for that Apple Magic was that we couldn't do as much. There was quite a limited amount of activities you could do, because you can only make everything feel magical if you limit what you're trying to make feel magical. But we're starting to see that range of features expand and expand. And the thing was, I was debating between the MacBook Air and the iPad Pro, because they do occupy quite a similar space in terms of what they offer. But what it came down to was not me thinking that the iPad Pro would be any more productive than the MacBook Air. It was actually that I thought that the screen quality and the speaker quality would just make it a nicer device overall. So I was considering the MacBook Air, but I read that it still doesn't have a P3 color gamut, which people are mentioning it, but seriously, they need to make the P3 color gamut be a thing on the MacBook Air. The fact it's still not there makes it look very bland in comparison to an iPad Pro screen or a MacBook Pro screen. And the 120Hz is just glorious on the iPad Pro. Yes, not all media supports it, but where you can use it for things like scrolling around web pages, general user interface tasks, it just elevates it so much. So I would wholeheartedly recommend buying the iPad Pro 2020. Perhaps unless you have the 2018 model, the differences just aren't really that significant. But if you haven't got an iPad Pro yet, or indeed any iPad at all, this is a fantastic place to jump in. It's difficult to imagine anyone being disappointed with this device. It really is just fantastic. It's light, it's portable, it's powerful, it is glorious to use. Like, it's one of Apple's most well-rounded products, in my opinion. So many of Apple products I like, but they have flaws, things that just stop them from being, absolutely perfect. But this is the closest to being their perfect product. As always, people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.